I came to pick up Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass in a roundabout way. Now, I had read parts of the book in high school and remember not being particularly fond of it. What is he going on about now was my first response to his rambling, almost encyclopedic take on the American countryside. I put it aside for many years. But what sparked my interest in the last couple of years in picking it back up, I am somewhat embarrassed to admit, was its presence on the hit TV show Breaking Bad. Leaves of Grass plays a pivotal role in unraveling the schemes of the main character, who also happens to be named Walt. Now, I won't go on about the show too much or get entrenched in the plot details there. Instead, today, I want to ask the question that puzzled me in high school so many years ago. What was Walt Whitman going on about in his sprawling poems? What was he going on about? What he was going on about, I only later came to appreciate during this second reading of his poetry, was what I think is the very stuff of life. Whitman's rambling poetry was an attempt to breathe life in, to drink it up, to experience everything that there was to experience. Reading his poetry strikes me as sort of like reading in spirals, where every loop of words is larger than the last, more expansive than the last, attempting to bring into its fold more of this thing called life than was spoken of in the last several stanzas. Whitman thought of his process as a celebration. I celebrate myself, he writes, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. In these words, which open his book, Leaves of Grass, we get the sense of his celebrating and his drinking in of life. We also get the sense of his camaraderie with others who share in this experience of celebrating and drinking in life. There is a deep love for his fellow human beings in his writings. It's a kinship that extends even beyond death to all of those who have come before. In one passage from Leaves of Grass, perhaps my favorite passage, Whitman reflects on the question, what is the grass? He goes through many different possibilities, the best of which, I think, is that the grass may be the uncut hair of graves. He says, tenderly I use you, curling grass. It may be that you transpired from the breasts of young men or women. It may be that if I had known them, I would have loved them. In the same way, I feel a sort of kinship with Walt Whitman. His poetry is also a celebration of such kinship. Let me tell you a little bit about his life. He was born in 1819 in Long Island, New York. And if you can imagine it, Long Island was a farming community at the time. He was the second of 8 children, born to a Quaker mother who opposed violence and affirmed the equality of all people. His father was a free thinker and a deist. Deism at the time was a philosophical system that sees God as establishing the laws of the universe, but then leaving the universe to tick on by itself, sort of like a clockmaker who winds up a clock and then steps away. Both of these religious views influenced the poetry of Whitman in various ways, and I'll get into that in a bit. When Whitman was 19, he founded a newspaper. He was the writer, the printer, the editor, and the delivery carrier. And so he had a big task. His self-assessment of him being lazy, which I read earlier, is a little bit striking when you think about that. But what that did was that starting that paper is what introduced him to writing, and he discovered in it a lifelong passion. At 23, he published his first and his best-selling book, at least the book that would be the best-selling in his lifetime. It was not poetry, but it was rather a novel about alcohol temperance. It sold 70,000 copies. His magnum opus, the book that he is most known for, would not emerge for another 13 years. But at age 36, he published his notebooks of experimental poetry, and he called that book Leaves of Grass. It consisted of 11 long, untitled poems. And to give you a sense of the length, the first poem is 44 pages long. He would edit this collection until his death, adding, subtracting, but mostly adding. Whitman was loquacious, verbose, talkative. I get the sense from reading his work that he thought that if he could just say more, just write more, he would finally capture something about the elusive essence of things. Whitman, in writing these poems, did not want to just write another poem. He wanted to capture something true and essential about life. As Mary Oliver put it, Whitman's message was clear that a better, richer life was available to us. With all his force, he advocated for it, both for the good of each individual soul and for the good of the universe. Whitman outlined his ambitions in this way: "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess not a poem, but the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and the sun. You shall no longer take things second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on ghosts in books. You shall not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You shall listen to all sides and then filter them for the sake of your own soul." Now, one might imagine that such poetry could be aesthetically pleasing, beautiful, but perhaps politically aloof. I, for one, picture Whitman out in the grass, seeking the stuff of life in nature, sort of like Henry David Thoreau. And like many transcendentalists at the time, he did seek inspiration in nature. However, his poetry was deeply politically engaged. He dedicated the work to America, a country that he imagined as having great potential, but that was on the verge of unraveling. At turns, he was angry and despairing, and at turns, he was optimistic and visionary. But at all times, Leaves of Grass is an ode to his vision of a radically equal society. In the preface to Leaves of Grass, he reflects on the meaning of poetry and where poetry can be found. He says that one place that poetry can be found is in the president's taking off his hat to the people, not them to him. He loved the fact that America proposed political equality and not an aristocratic or monarchical system. He goes on to say that the American bard, the American poet, shall delineate no class of persons, nor one or two out of the strata of interests. In other words, he wrote his poetry not for a particular class of people, nor does he intend it for a significant other in his life. Instead, it is for everyone, a celebration of everyone, and a breaking apart of the barriers that separate one group from another in this society. Now, in case you are not convinced that his writing is politically engaged, Whitman spells this out even more clearly as he goes along. He is never at a lack for words. He writes, "The attitude of poets is to cheer up slaves and horrify despots." He saw his writing as politically seditious, tearing apart structures of oppression. His wish was to affirm liberty by undercutting, and I quote, "the swarms of cringers, suckers, dough-faces, the lice of politics, planners of sly involutions for their own preferment to city offices or state legislatures or the judiciary or Congress." Yeah, he didn't have very nice things to say about those who use politics to advance their own interests or to undercut political equality. His vision for politics grew in many ways out of his theology, a theology that many of us Unitarian Universalists would find quite familiar. I mentioned earlier that Whitman's mother affirmed the idea that every person has a spark of the divine in them. And I believe that this theological vision underlies many of Whitman's affirmations about political equality. For instance, he says, "It is also not consistent with the reality of the soul to admit that there is anything in the known universe more divine than men and women." This conviction led him to affirm radical political equality while rejecting slavery and sexism and other forms of oppression in his day. Now, it is widely acknowledged that Whitman had same-gender attractions. My colleague Roger Jones has written about this aspect of Whitman's life, and I use parts of his account here. What many readers may find amazing is that Whitman's poetry celebrated his attractions almost brazenly. Whitman's verses praise physical affection and love between males, and he was close to many men in his life. Now, this may not actually be as groundbreaking as it first appears. In pre-Civil War America, friendships between people of the same sex were passionate and intimate. Emerson's biographer David Reynolds notes that the word lover was often used in place of friend at the time. The lack of specific categories for sexual orientation made same-sex affection less self-conscious. Men had the freedom to kiss in public, hold hands, write poems to each other born out of the deepest love, and even share a bed, all without being ostracized or punished by law. Whitman writes, "The hugging and loving bedfellow sleeps at my side through the night and withdraws at the peep of day with stealthy tread." Whitman may have had one or two heterosexual involvements in his life, but he never married. Most scholars agree that he was gay, but he denied it in public. He resisted his own impulses, at least for some of the time. Whitman was drawn to a number of younger men and either had or wanted to have sexual involvements with them. Whitman's notebooks contain certain passages in code using numbers in place of names, and in some cases he uses feminine pronouns to refer to the men that he loved, including a railway conductor and a printer's apprentice. Whitman says it is feverish, useless, and humiliating to stay in pursuit of one of them. Later, he writes these private words: "An athlete is enamored of me and I of him, but towards him there is something fierce and terrible in me eligible to burst forth. I dare not tell it in words, not even in these songs." Whitman's poetry is perhaps remarkable in this sense. He seemed often to push beyond the acceptable realm of same-gender affection into romantic pursuit in his poems. Now, Whitman did appear to have some successful relationships. They were not always unrequited. He had a relationship with a younger man by the name of Henry Stafford, whose family treated him well, according to his biographer. Whitman stayed as a paying guest at the Stafford family farm, and he also had a few other intimate relationships that seemed to be quite fulfilling to him. But whatever his relationships with other men or women, it is clear that Whitman honored and loved the body. He thought that it was an expression of the divine, and he did not see a neat separation between the body and the soul. Or if he did, it was tenuous at best. The spirit, writes the poet, receives from the body just as much as it gives to the body. In another famous poem that Pat read earlier, he sings the body electric. And so the writings of his attractions and his relationships were not ancillary notes or wandering digressions to what he was trying to accomplish in his writings. They were part and parcel of his worldview, the very stuff of life that Whitman thought was holy and that he wanted so desperately to capture in words. For Whitman, nothing evaded the brush with the holy, the touch of transcendence. It was all holy. Mary Oliver said that Whitman conceived Leaves of Grass as a book to live by. It is obsessively affirmative, she says. It is foolishly, childishly, obsessively affirmative. It offers a way to live in the religious sense. I agree with Mary Oliver. If I could put Leaves of Grass next to other books on my shelf, it would not necessarily be next to other books of poetry. Instead, I would set it next to other manuals about how to live. It is a comprehensive vision of politics, nature, sexuality, the body, and how to discover the holy in the everyday. It is a beautiful vision, and today I am grateful that such a person as Walt Whitman lived and breathed and wrote down a few of his thoughts. May his journey provide something in way of an inspiration for yours. Amen. I love you, and blessings on your journey.